making Labyrinth prop replicas for a good few years now. So much time has passed, in fact, that at this point I'm mostly done making new replicas, and I've been more focused on going back and remaking some of my earliest projects. One such project is the Jareth statue that appears in Sarah's bedroom. That's this spooky looking guy right here. My first attempt at replicating this prop was a hand-sculpted creation made out of oven-baked polymer clay. That's the version that you can see in the video where I show off the upgrades to my music box replica, for any OG channel subscribers. This first Jareth is obviously not the best looking thing ever. Not only am I not great at hand sculpting, but he also recently suffered a pretty big bust up, and he's desperately needing to be put out to pasture. In the years since I made version 1 of the Jareth statue, I've started dabbling in 3D printing. So that's the route I've decided to go with for version 2, and what this video is going to show. The journey I took making a 3D modeled and printed version of the Jareth statue from Labyrinth. I modeled Jareth in Blender, which is a free, open-source 3D modeling program. YouTube is a great source of information for teaching yourself Blender, which is what I did. I followed a lot of tutorials and putzed around in Blender in my spare time until I finally reached a point where I felt like I had the minimum amount of required knowledge needed to sculpt something as complicated as Jareth. The actual Jareth statue has shown up in various museum exhibits over the years, and while I have sadly not seen it in person, I have collected lots of reference photos from folks who have, mostly from Labyrinth fan groups on Facebook, but also just from Google image searches. I want to give a specific shout out to Chris Devers on Flickr for uploading this really nice, high quality close-up of the statue. This was a huge help for me in this project. This comes from Chris's album of photos he took at the Jim Henson exhibit, Imagination Unlimited, so I'll link his album in the video description below. Please give it a look if you are interested. I knew even with reference photos, I wouldn't be able to match the sculpt of the original statue exactly, so I just did my best and hope for something that, at least at first glance, would pass for correct. You know, going more for a feeling of accuracy rather than technical, true accuracy. And as an FYI, I'm doing the old-timey YouTuber method of recording my screen with an external camera because my laptop is a little decrepit, and it has a hard enough time running just Blender, so I think if I tried to run Blender and a screen capture software at the same time, my computer would probably just explode. I also did not learn how to export and render scenes in Blender, because again, I learned the minimum amount of required knowledge to 3D model, and so rendering and exporting was not part of that minimum. But yeah, my poor laptop felt like it was going to explode a few times during the modeling process, which did contribute to some of the grief and frustration this project gave me, but I will get into that a bit later. Once I was happy with the model, I chopped it into pieces and started printing off said pieces using my 3D printer. I feel like by now most folks are at least somewhat familiar with 3D printing, so for the sake of time, I'll try speeding through this bit as well. My printer is an Elegoo Mars 2 Pro, which prints by exposing thin layers of UV-sensitive resin to UV light, building layer by layer until after many hours, you have a finished print. Once you are done printing, you peel off the print support structures, wash your prints of any excess resin, and then do a final blast of UV light, after which the pieces are safe to handle. Jareth himself is made out of a total of 15 different pieces, and the cape is in 4 pieces. In total, it took about 40 hours for all the various pieces of Jareth to be printed, and another 40 hours for all the pieces of his cape to print. Mostly thanks to my printer being just a tiny bit small. There was just a limit to how much I could fit on the printer bed at a time. Some of the pieces I hollowed out before printing to save on resin, so in addition to thoroughly rinsing out the hollow cavity, I used this contraption I got from Etsy to try and make sure the inside of those pieces were fully cured. These are some UV LEDs attached to a battery. They're not very strong LEDs, but they do enough to make me feel a little more confident that there's no excess resin on the inside of the hollow cavities. I'll put a link to the store that I got this from in the video description below. The holes left over from the hollowing process will be filled in later. I'm still fairly new to the 3D printing process, so I'm learning as I go. One of the learnings I can share is emphasizing how important the position of your model is during printing. I have here two of the exact same piece of Jareth, the only difference being that the piece on the right was angled in a way that the support structures all fell on the cuff of the jacket, whereas the piece on the left, I angled it so that most of the support structures fell on just the edge of the cuff. And as you can see, the piece on the left has way fewer blemishes from the removal of these support structures. And if you screw up and miss adding some of your support structures altogether, you might end up with a print that isn't fully complete, like this first attempt I did at Jareth's left hand. Obviously, with everything in pieces, I'm going to need to do some work attaching everything and filling in seams. But I'm also going to need to sand off those aforementioned blemishes from the support structures, as well as smooth out any of the visible layer lines left behind from the printing process. I gave every piece an initial round of wet sanding, which is basically just regular sanding with water and special sandpaper, with the water helping to reduce and control the amount of dust produced from the sanding. The sanding only goes so far though, as there's some larger divots from the removal of the support structures I need to fill. For that, I got some of this Tamiya putty, so I just smear it on, and then once it's dry, I do another round of sanding. I'm also going to use the putty to help fill in some of the seam lines of the sculpt, and this is where I realized in some cases the bumps left from the supports were interfering with the fit of these separate pieces. So I busted out this fancy dust collector. It's originally meant for collecting dust from acrylic nails, like when you're working on in a salon. And then I just dremeled the pieces over this dust collector until things seemed to fit better. I didn't fully trust this dust collector, so I did also wear a mask during this step, just in case. You really don't want resin particulate getting into your lungs. Some pieces, like the legs, needed to be joined together before another round of sanding. I generally tried to separate Jareth's pieces in a way that make painting easier, but in this case, the two legs were printed separately because I just couldn't fit both legs on my small print bed at the same time. Oh, and slightly related, regarding the scale of this statue, the real Jareth statue appears to be pretty dang big, at least based on my impression of screenshots from the movie and images of the actual statue on display. I scaled my Jareth based on what made sense for my size printer, as well as the height of the IKEA shelves where I keep my Labyrinth props, making sure that he could fit nicely onto the shelf. For filling in larger gaps and connections, I picked up this 2-part putty. Basically just mix 2 equal parts together, and after curing, it'll be rock hard. You could also see me awkwardly using a wooden dowel here as an internal support structure for the leg pieces I'm joining together. Pro tip, pet nail clippers work great for cutting wooden dowels. And also, if you want to prevent your putty from sticking to the wrong side of your model as you're pressing things together, a thin coating of Vaseline applied to the side that you don't want stuck will prevent that. I didn't do that in this instance, but I should have, and I did so for future pieces. But yeah, I added the putty, then set it aside to cure, and once it was cured, I glued the legs together with some 2-part epoxy glue, and then finished filling in the seam with more of that gray putty from earlier. One thing I neglected to do, thanks to my laptop struggles with Blender, was add keys to my printed pieces. These are basically just little nubs or tabs that lock into corresponding slots, and they help you make sure that everything is going to fit together correctly. I regret not having these on my prints, because I did have some issues with fit and alignment. In a few cases, I did try and add a key after the fact, using some of the cutouts that came from the hollowing process of the prints. Normally, you would just plug these cutouts back into their respective holes to close up the gap. Instead, I glued them onto other pieces of the model, so that they kind of acted like keys, like when you slotted them together. The video is hopefully way more clearer than this awful narrated description. To reinforce any of the areas where two pieces are being joined together, I inserted a metal pin, or in my case, a jumbo paper clip that I scraped the color coding off of and cut down to size. Here's an example of what I do to try and position the pin correctly. In this instance, I drilled a hole into one of Jareth's hands, then I put some kneaded eraser on his arm roughly where I wanted the arm and hand to connect. Squeezing the two pieces together, then separating them, leaves me with this little indent in the kneaded eraser that I could then mark with a pin and then drill a corresponding hole into. The pin is glued into only one of the printed pieces, as I want them to remain separate for painting. Please ignore that there is obviously a second hole drilled. Let's just pretend that I did this perfectly the first time and no retakes were needed. All of this business about pinning and puttying, and basically all of my knowledge about how to go about assembling and painting this statue have come from watching GK model builder and painter Leona's workshop here on YouTube. I almost hesitated mentioning Leona here because I don't feel like I did her instructions justice. I screwed up so many times and made life harder on myself because I just didn't correctly follow her recommendations. So if you actually want to learn from a professional how to go about assembling and painting something like this statue, go check out Leona and her many videos on the subject. I will put a link to her channel in the description below the video. Jareth's cape was the biggest pain in my butt to sand and assemble. Sanding took a while because I deliberately left the cape low poly. Once again, my laptop was really struggling with Blender, and at the time I thought, no big deal. I will just leave the model as is, printed as is, and I'll just do more sanding after it's printed. But yeah, that was horrendous. And I ended up just doing so much sanding that I basically rubbed my thumb raw. But the other pain in the butt with the cape was that it was in 4 pieces, and for some reason those 4 pieces just did not slot together well. I genuinely don't know where I went wrong here. I think it might have been something to do with how I split the cape, because I tried to just do it along where the natural mesh lines of the model fell, kind of these wavy curves here. But maybe it would have been better if these pieces were just like straight edges sitting flush against each other. I don't know, but yeah, something here just didn't line up. Long story short, I had to do a lot of fiddling and sanding and puttying and swearing, and I did eventually get the cape into a single piece. But yeah, there's some improvement that needs to be done here if I ever do reprint Jareth again. At this point, I did a test fit of all the pieces, and you can kind of see how it's all coming together. Again, I think there's a lot of room for improvement with the fit of everything. You do have to fiddle with it to find a sweet spot for the, placement of all the individual pieces, which, in a well-designed model, I think there'd be less of, if any at all. But trying to cut myself a bit of slack. This is, at least to date anyways, my most ambitious 3D printing project. So it's not going to be perfect right out the bat, even though I would love desperately to be perfect on the first try. Jareth's crop, by the way, isn't fully 3D printed. Just the handle is printed, the rest of the crop is actually just a toothpick that I glued into a 3D print. The grip of Jareth's raised arm is just loose enough that I could slide the crop in, and I don't need to use glue or anything, it just sits in there very nicely. Despite all of the sanding that I already did, I noticed that there were a few spots that needed another pass. So I decided to do another round of primer using this Rust-Oleum filler primer spray. This is a thicker spray, which is great to fill in small gaps, but I didn't want to fill in any fine detail on Jareth's face, so I used some poster putty to mask that area off before spraying. For my painting setup, I'm taking a page from Studson Studios and using alligator clips paired with one of those cardboard cat scratchers to hold up all the different pieces of Jareth. They clip onto pins that I installed earlier. I once again wet sanded all of my prime pieces, adding more putty when needed to try and get as smooth of a surface as I could. And I didn't get footage of this, but after the last round of sanding, I did do a final coat of primer, this time using some white fine spray surface primer from Tamiya. As for the paint job, I'm showing off a range of Tamiya paints here, but I'll note that these color choices changed slightly as I began painting. For example, that champagne gold color that I thought would be perfect for Jareth's skin, surprise, surprise, it was metallic. You know, like how gold usually is. I don't know why that thought didn't occur to me. I guess I was just basing it off of the appearance of the cap, which did not strike me as super metallic looking. But Jareth is looking like he stepped out of a James Bond movie. So I ended up getting another can of this light gray color, and I did a light dusting of that over the metallic paint. I actually left a bit of the metallic paint coming through, because I did like the slight sparkle that it left. That felt very Jareth to me, so, For parts of the sculpt that required different colors, I used a few different methods to mask off certain areas of the sculpt, to differing degrees of success. I found that poster putty was the most successful method of masking for me, though even saying that I didn't do the greatest of jobs with it, so I had to fix my mistakes. I ended up getting some Tamiya paint thinner, and I sprayed a bit of the rattle can paint onto the back of this silicone mat. And then I used some of the thinner to make a brush on paint to do any touch-ups. I'm just miming that here. You do have to kind of work fast with this, because the rattle can paint starts to dry very quickly, and I did not want to have to rush on camera and risk screwing something up, so miming it is. Here's the complete list of paint I ended up using for my Jareth statue. It might be worth a mention that I slightly regretted using the Tamiya brand of paints for this project. I love the color range, love that I was able to avoid brushstrokes by finding these beautiful colors in aerosol can, but these paints are just expensive, and I ended up needing multiple cans of the deep metallic blue color specifically. So yeah, the paint budget for this project was way more than I thought it was going to be. But anyways, that's the base coat of all of the pieces sprayed, so now it was the stressful time to try and attach Jareth's head to his body. This is one of my big regrets for how I split the pieces of Jareth. At the time I was thinking that having the joint at the base of Jareth's neck would be better for printing, like his head would be, like it was safer for his head to print with the neck. And maybe it was, but it meant that there was now this big visible seam at the base of the neck that I had to deal with. And because of how I made the jacket lapels their own separate piece, I had to put the lapels on, and then the head, which meant that it was really hard to putty and sand the seam in this area. And then, of course, I had to retouch up the paint, which is also a pain. I had to mask everything off, and then try and spray it to get in the little crevice that I now created, and then some of the paint got underneath the masking, and then I had to, retouch up that paint.
We haven't got all day.
Okay, yeah, anyways. Spoilers for the finished statue, but you can kind of see the seam if you know where to look. So, yeah, if I ever make this statue again, I think I'm going to try and move the seam so that it's underneath the chin, and then hopefully that way, if there is still a seam, it's a little less noticeable. It's kind of tucked away under the chin. At this point, it was thankfully now time to do all the fun finishing details. Sometimes when I'm working on these projects, there is a point that I reach where I am just sick of working on them. So yeah, I was very happy to get to this point. I had bought 3 little pots of brush-on paint, a white, a light blue, and a darker blue. I used the light blue mostly to add a bit of dimension to the shadowy places on Jareth's sculpt, like the streaks in his hair, or the folds in his skin or on his shirt. And of course I used it for his eyeshadow as well. Did not capture any of the painting of the face on camera, because I prioritized doing a good paint job over getting good footage for this video. Sorry, not sorry. Any of the light areas of the sculpture, like the hair, the skin, Jareth's shirt and tights, I dry brushed the white paint over that to bring out some of the details of the raised points of the sculpt. Dry brushing being basically just putting some paint on your brush, wiping most of it off just so that you have the barest whisper of paint left on your brush, so that you're only getting just a little tiny bit on whatever you're painting when you're brushing across it. And as you might have guessed, the dark areas of the sculpt, like the boots and anywhere I use that deep metallic blue spray paint color, I dry brushed on some of the blue brush-on paint. I had actually been really unsure about this deep metallic blue paint for a while. I applied it fairly thick, trying to get an even coat, and I thought it was potentially too dark as a result. But the dry brushing really did wonders here. It lined everything up, but it also still left me some of the nice dark blue in the recessed areas, so the final paint job has a lot of depth, and I really, really like how this turned out. Jareth's coat has this bit of scroll work on the cuffs. To plan that out, I used a watercolor pencil to make a sketch, and then I just went over that with the brush-on paint and a very fine-tip brush. The nice thing about the watercolor pencil is that you can basically erase it with a bit of water, which didn't affect the spray paint I used, since the Tamiya paint is not activated by water like acrylic paint would be. I will say, I regret not sculpting the scroll work directly onto the cuff of the jacket in Blender. I was following what was done on the original prop, where it also seems to just be painted on, but in hindsight, I just think it would have looked a bit more refined, and it definitely would have been easier for me to paint if it was a raised edge that I could have just accentuated with the paint. I did all of this painting on a silicone pet food mat that I got from the dollar store, but since making this statue, my sister and brother-in-law gifted me a fancy wet palette, so I'll be putting that to use in a future project. Once I was done with the detail work, I spray painted each piece with a sealant, in this case a semi-gloss also from Tamiya. I then assembled Jareth off screen because, again, I was prioritizing doing a good job over getting good camera footage. With Jareth assembled, it was almost time for the grand reveal. Firstly, I had to give Jareth his very own photoshoot. I went all out making the set for this one. I basically tried to recreate Sarah's vanity from the film as best as I could, using mostly dollar store or thrift store items. My favorite detail about this set are the fake newspaper clippings I made that use the actual photos from the original film. Special shout out to Laszlo, also known as Labyrinth_Dark Crystal on Instagram, for posting this picture in a Labyrinth fan group on Facebook. Laszlo attended the 2023 Labyrinth experience, where Jim Henson archivist Karen Falk showed off these and other goodies from the Henson archive. I cleaned up the photo a bit in Photoshop and then printed it out on some... It's not quite newsprint, but it's close enough for what I needed. This set is a little ramshackle, and that's why I wanted to highlight it in this video, because I think it demonstrates how something that looks a little goofy in real life can be transformed with the right lighting. And on that note, it is finally time for the glamour shots. I'm really happy with how these glamour shots turned out. I have two sets of photos, the first being this kind of spooky and nighttime themed set. I was trying to do a more mysterious and maybe slightly eerie vibe to these photos, trying to match the beginning of the film, where Jareth first appears to Sarah. The second set is a cheerier, kind of sunrise-lit scene. I have a lot of trouble figuring out how to light an image brightly, but in an interesting way, so I made it a personal challenge to try and get these sunnier shots. I don't know if I really learned anything, if I'm being honest. I don't know if I could ever recreate the magic of this particular lighting setup. It looks beautiful, but I don't know how much of that beauty was because of the deliberate decisions that I made. Oh, and I very nearly forgot to mention this, but the crystal that my Jareth statue is holding is just a little glass marble. Although I'll point out, it is the same marble that I used for my version 1 of the statue. When I redo my prop builds, I do like to try and reuse a piece of my old prop with the redo. It's kind of like a passing of the torch combined with a Ship of Theseus sort of thing. I get a bit sentimental about objects, and so this is a small thing that it helps me feel okay with letting go of that first version of the prop. That about wraps this video up. I had a few more folks share with me their own Labyrinth prop builds, made using the tutorials I've shared on YouTube. First up is Charlotte, who made this adorable fiery plush as a Christmas gift. I am very honored that my tutorial played a role in making someone's Christmas a little more merry. Next up is BowHeadMakes, who also made a fiery plush. BowHeadMakes actually live streamed the making of her fiery plush on her Twitch channel, where she not only does crafting live streams, but video game live streams as well. I'll include a link to her Twitch channel in the video description, and I'd encourage everyone to go check out her channel. If anyone else out there uses my tutorials to make their own Labyrinth props, I'd love to see them. You can reach out to me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and now Blue Sky as KO Makes Things. Admittedly, I'm not super active on Twitter anymore, but I'm still holding on to the account, so if you message me on there, I will see it. And if you guys aren't on any of those, let me know, because maybe I should just make an official email address that people can send photos to. If that's of any interest to people, please feel free to say so in the comments below the video. But with that, thanks again for tuning in, everyone, and I shall talk to you next time.